What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 15 Cash Game Review Show. I am your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com. As always, with my co-host, Matt Savoca. Before we get into the show today, just want to tell everybody about the easiest and most fun way to spice up your fantasy football season. It is the Underdog Fantasy and their brand new Pick'em game. Just pick the over or the under on your favorite or your least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players. You could take home some cold, hard cash. Head over to 4for4.com/underdog to claim your free 4for4 Pro subscription and get $10 in bonus cash to play this weekend. Matt, one of the ugliest slates that we have had maybe ever, but for cash games, it went kind of as expected. Like, we obviously had some big duds, but neither of us had big whiffs. So how was your week?
Yeah, it went okay. Went all right. As you said, we had a crazy week. We had a fun DFS MVP on Friday. Yeah. And honestly, by the time we hit Sunday, I felt like I had sifted through the news. I kind of knew what the slate was looking like. I don't know if it's something we can take going forward. Just that level of almost ambivalence that we kind of had a little bit about the week because of how much news there had been. Kind of let us play a little loose and just follow the value in the right way. Ended up being fine. 63rd percentile, 18% ROI, and we're moving forward. Not a bad cash week.
No, we'll take it. Anything in the black in DFS is a good week. So let's throw your lineup up and look over some of what you built, and then some of the hits and misses. Or let's start with the hits and your locks on those builds.
Yeah, so I knew it was a 4 wide receiver week. I knew you were tweeting about it, and we were talking about it on the show on Friday. It was just one of the ugliest running back slates I can ever remember. Yeah. Just not anything of note. And really, James Robinson, who was what you could call good chalk this week, wasn't really that great chalk. Right. There was nothing I would consider great chalk at the running back position. And so one of my locks of the week was that this is a 4 wide receiver week. Obviously, Cooper Kupp becomes unavailable due to the postponement. And so my anchor point, which, patent pending, at this point, my anchor point was Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, and George Kittle. Yeah. That trio, I was going to figure it out from there. If it meant getting a value at quarterback, so be it. But ultimately, by the time we hit Sunday, the next thing to lock in was Kyler Murray, because I felt like there were so many ways he could hit. And if there is a week where the running back scores you're going to need are a little bit lower than usual, and I'm going to be playing 2 value wide receivers in Gabe Davis and Devontae Parker, higher raw points are going to matter. So all of a sudden, Josh Allen or Kyler Murray became much more important to me, thus locking in Kyler. And then from there, as I mentioned just a moment ago, then I was just doing Devontae Parker, Gabe Davis, going to eat the chalk there with the value wide receivers. And I felt that the value wide receivers plus James Robinson was the best chalk I could get based on where I was going. So from there, I just fit in another one. Unfortunately, I had Donta Foreman higher in my rankings and talked myself out of it Sunday morning, but we'll get to that in the misses.
Yeah, I mean, it was it was such a small slate. We got down to 9 teams after all of the COVID news, and then there were just so few obvious value plays that a guy like James Robinson, even though there were lots of ways that he could have a rough game, there just wasn't a running back projecting that with any type of consistency that he was. So anywhere you went at your running back too, it was kind of hard to argue with. It was a really unique week in terms of expectation of anybody with a floor. And this is for GPPs, but when I was projecting ownership on both sites, it was really hard to just fill out ownership. I know most people don't do their own ownership projections, but ownership has to go up to a certain number because everybody has to roster each position. And I was having a hard time even figuring out how it gets filled up. So that's why I said the chalky players will probably be even more chalky than we expect. And when we have a week like that, when you have a player like Devontae and Kittle on the slate, there just aren't players that are going to project anywhere close to them. And that's why tournaments was hard, because we talk about Z-scores and replacement level compared to the top guys. And the top guys were just blowing away the field this week. So it really made a lot of sense in cash games to get to them.
In the biggest double up that I joined with over 16,000 contestants, Devontae Adams was
Yeah,
93%
yeah,
owned.
crazy.
So one of those situations where we're just obviously eating that chalk and then figuring out our lineup from there. So some key misses here. I definitely missed on Kyler Murray. Kind of an unprecedented loss there. I mean, I'm not sure what the heck happened. They're gonna have to figure things out. And I did have Donta Foreman as my what the heck flex for running back two
Yeah,
instead of Devonta Freeman, ultimately choosing to go at the game that I thought had higher shootout potential.
yeah,
Didn't know that Devonta Freeman was basically going to be Latavius Murray's backup. Wasn't aware of that fact going in, but and everyone else on that team balled out. So I just guessed, I guessed right on the team, wrong on the player. That's not so bad. And then Jaguars getting 2 points, 3 points here. That was always in the range of outcomes. They would just happen
yeah.
to be a home favorite that fit in the salary, fit in the budget in a weird week, and let me get up to three studs plus a stud quarterback. So while it was a miss, the strategy around it, I'm still going to go with it. I'm still going to play home favorites next time around.
Yeah. What was your deciding factor in Kyler versus Josh Allen? They were only $100 apart.
Yeah, Kyler just had more upside with his rushing, with
Yeah.
Josh Allen being slightly injured. I mean, he
Yep.
seemed fine, and obviously he gets there with multiple passing touchdowns. Kyler has a huge off day, but I just figured rushing upside is what I was just going to lean on.
Yeah. And then Deontay Foreman was a decent value on 4 for 4. He was 5,800. It was a top 10 running back value, but that's not super high. This was a week where we talk so much about the 4 for 4 value rankings and how accurate they are and how much we really lean into them. This was a week where I'm not saying the projections weren't reliable, but it was just the position was so bad after James Robinson that I thought it actually kind of made sense to get away from some of those plays and go with like I know best in terms of just the profiles of running backs. So I was actually surprised that Deontay Foreman was a player that a lot of sharp players were targeting. What was your thought? I know you didn't use Foreman, but you were thinking about using him. What was your thought process on him? Because the week before, they were like in a straight up three-way split in Tennessee's
Yeah,
backfield.
it didn't look great, but I thought that Tennessee wasn't going to move away from a rush focused
Hmm.
attack against Pittsburgh,
Sure.
especially with Pittsburgh essentially being the worst rush defense by far in the
Yeah.
NFL over the last few weeks. So I figured the matchup was good enough. And one thing I did look at is one of the reason I thought it was a split last week is because their win probability was so high at a certain point. So I thought that if you got into a more neutral game script, you were going to see more of Donta Foreman. Also, when you just optimize for value, when you try to just get the most value in your lineup, I was
Yeah.
getting these 5,800, 6K running backs a lot.
Yeah.
I didn't really feel that strongly. So ultimately, I went
Sure.
with the backup quarterback, who we often see backup quarterbacks dumping it down to their tight ends and running backs. The playing time just wasn't there. I
Yeah.
think yeah, the
No, for
fundamentals
sure.
were fine.
Did when we I guess we couldn't really build the lineup because it was the late game, but I know some people were like already kind of considering Huntley and Cash, then maybe doing a pivot. Were you ever thinking about that, or just if it was an early window, would you maybe have considered it?
I maybe would have considered it if it was early. I would have loved, and honestly, if one of those top tier quarterbacks were late, it would have been lock it in that
Yeah,
one
sure.
because I would have known to pivot off of it, and I would have had a lot of salary if I wanted to pivot. But Huntley really wasn't somewhere I was getting all that much. The Packers defense had looked strong, and maybe I should have adjusted a little bit more, but I was pretty locked into it being a low scoring week and therefore wanting a high scoring quarterback.
Yeah, with a lot of your players were late, especially your expensive guys, Kittle, Adams, and then Debo. So I mean, even though Kyler bust, were you still just like I still have so many of my studs left late that I'm not even really worried about late swapping right now.
Yeah,
And honestly, you're probably still sitting decent, like after Parker and Gabe get there, right?
Gabe hits the second touchdown, and I was
Yeah,
like, I think I might be okay holding. And I
yeah,
looked at about 5 to 8 of my head to heads to get a sample of where I was from a
yeah,
PMR standpoint. And noticing that Devontae Adams looked like he was going to be super, super highly owned in all these tournaments, I went, all right, I think I can hold here. There might be some situations where I need to make one-off switches, but
Yeah.
yeah, it went fine.
Yeah, I talked about it on the GPP Last Look show that I thought it was like a really tough week for late swap because we had Kyler and Josh early, but then we had the Niners and the Packers late. So like even if you played those quarterbacks, you were likely to have in any type of format, you were likely to have a lot of high salary players left to go, and it just really made late swapping decisions really difficult, and probably just froze a lot of people, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was tough to figure out late swap. Is there anything that stood out? I mean, you talked about the Freeman Foreman play a little bit, but anything that stood out from, even though you had a really good build, that you would have liked to switch up a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, A-Rod was definitely on the premier quarterback list, and he obviously
Yeah,
gets there. Not as great as Huntley, but I'll be honest, I wasn't adding Huntley to my player pool at that point.
yeah,
The Jeff Wilson Jr. gets there this week, and honestly, I'm thinking about it. Like, if I had late swapped, I probably swapped to something like Andrews and Jeff Wilson Jr. and end up having a better day. But I think that's just variance. I think the strategy of just holding tight was correct. But Jeff Wilson Jr. ends up being 53% owned in the biggest tournament or excuse me,
yeah,
the biggest double up I was in. If I had known he was going to come in that highly
yeah,
owned, I'd probably just eat that. That's my backup running back. And one of the reasons I went with Devonta Freeman was because he was in the later game and Donta Foreman was in the earlier game. But I feel like that's most people, once Jeff Wilson opened up, they went there. I actually unchecked. I excluded the rest of the Atlanta San Francisco game. I felt like 3 players from that game was too much, but maybe I should have taken the negative correlation and just gone with it.
yeah. We talk a lot about letting letting other players just make mistakes in cash games. Jeff Wilson is an example of how the field has gotten sharper in a sense where if it was 3 or 4 years ago and Jeff Wilson was coming off of the game that he came off of, nobody would have used him in any format. So I mean that is a sign of the evolution of the game and something that we need to keep in the back of our minds. But even with all that, I was still pretty surprised that he came in that high as well. Did you talked about A-Rod already, and he's always a hard one because like especially in cash games. He used to give us a little bit of running. He doesn't anymore, and he's always priced like at a spot where he always like needs 3 touchdowns. So even if the matchup is great, it's just always hard for Rodgers to get there in cash. But I mean, you talked about him, but anything else you noticed in really good top lineups this week?
Yeah, obviously, if you played Mark Andrews, you had a
Yeah,
great day. He
yeah,
went nuts. If you avoided Miles Gaskin, you probably had a good day. And there was honestly a decent amount of Brandon Cooks because people were playing James
yeah,
Robinson, and Brandon Cooks was only 6,900. You could really
yeah,
get there this week depending on the type of build you had. So I saw a lot of that. Trying to look through. Obviously, Gabriel Davis was the chalk you wanted to have at wide
yep,
receiver. 23-point game is huge, especially at that 4,900 salary. That's essentially a had to have it score.
yep.
And even Devontae Parker at high ownership gets there as well. So, there were variants on this that did much, much better, but
Yeah.
honestly, a lot of them had this as a core.
Yeah, I think I think if again we harp on it so much, if you really and that's I think we actually talked about it at the beginning of our DGAF episode on Friday that these are the kind of weeks where even though it is ugly, if you really understand core concepts, you should at least like for cash games, you should have a really high expectations of weeks like this. Like I was really confident in cash games this week, and I assume you were too because core concepts really got you there. And so many people that don't have a lot of DFS experience want to look at this player's good, this player's bad, and like that's just not how DFS works. Like we play players that we understand that playing a Devontae Freeman isn't the best feeling in the world, but the way it makes your lineup work and understanding that Parker and Gabe Davis are just like slam dunk values, the lineups just really start to build themselves the more you do this. So yeah, I think it's a really good example of just core concepts of DFS, this lineup.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? You can do that. What were talking about with this player's good. There's nothing about their matchup that stands out in tournaments. Do that
Right,
whole
right.
thinking in
Definitely.
tournaments. I leaned on Joe Mixon in tournaments because it's just a good player who, in my opinion, was overlooked. Didn't work out. That's fine. But don't use that thinking in cash. go
Right.
with the value, grab the touches. But one thing I will say is I didn't want to play the value game 3 times at the running back position. That's why I ended
I
up
know.
with a 4 wide receiver week. So after Robinson, just choose one. Dart throw.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree with that. I think it was really obvious for wide receiver week on on both sites. They're just the position, the running back position was just so awful. Unless you have any last thoughts on FanDuel, we could hop on over to DK and take a look at that.
I'm good. Yeah.
Cool. So I was very similar to you in where I had a build that was slightly above average, 64th percentile, profited, pretty easily in cash games and never had a lot of late swap considerations or things that I was, working too hard to figure out once the slate finally panned out and we actually knew who was going to be playing. And I said it at the end of our episode on Friday that as we talked through all of that late breaking news on Friday before we recorded, as we talked through it, like even by the end of that episode, I was like, this build is kind of building itself if you really understand where the values are coming from. There were 5 players on the slate that were in at least 45%. This is one of the largest field $100 double ups. James Robinson, Devontae Parker, Devontae Adams, Bills defense, Gabe Davis, all in at least 45% of lineups. All players that were very obvious values to me, and all players that that I had locked into my lineup. James Robinson, all the way up at 88%, is insanely high. But I mean, we talk about letting players make mistakes. Gabe Davis was in 47% of cash game builds, and that's a high number, but that means over
It
half
should have
of the
been way
field,
higher.
over half of the field is avoiding which is easily the best cash game value on the slate, besides James Robinson, which is just that is insane to me. And that's where if half of the field is making that big of an error, it's just a trickle down effect to what happens to your lineups. And then a second egregious error on even in those 47% of lineups that did use him, it's just a trickle down effect, and that's how you stay ahead of the field when it seems obvious to us. I mean, we do this day in and day out, so these things do seem obvious, and that's why we say cash game is a game of just letting other players make mistakes. If you are very savvy and paying attention to this lineup, you probably won't notice it just at first glance, but this lineup left $400 on the table. It's something that I almost never do in any format, but from my perspective, there were 7 players that I had to have basically, so there was nothing to sway me to force in that extra $400 build. The players that I was locked in on, I was always playing James Robinson. I was always playing this 3 wide receiver core besides Braxton Berrios. And then from there, there was a little bit of mobility in what I wanted to do.
Yeah, so I mean, you definitely got to explain the Barrios hit. I definitely understand once Barrios gets that 10-point score and your off the wall play of the day hits along with the big chalk plays, you're probably sitting pretty. You're not in any need of late swap, even though Gaskin and Murray disappoint. What was leaning you towards Barrios as that final flex play?
So Barrios was really popping in our lineup generator. He saw 10 targets the week before, and Miami was a really big favorite. So the game script obviously didn't go exactly as expected, but with that big spread, I think it ended up closing at 9.5. We thought that the Jets would be in a play from behind mode. So coming off of a 10 target game with Elijah Moore on IR the previous week, I thought the floor was there, but it wasn't so much that I was targeting Braxton Berrios. It's once I put all of those other players into my pool, I wouldn't consider Myles Gaskin necessarily a lock, but when I looked at the player pool, he looked like my favorite value after James Robinson. The other one that was popping was Michael Carter on the 4-for-4 lineup generator. I was just never playing Michael Carter. I just didn't. I thought there was a really good, and this goes back to my point of not that I don't trust the 4-4 projections 99.9% of the time, but his salary was so low and his projection was just even just a moderate projection put him really high on the value list because the position was so bad. I was just really the high ankle sprain. That's the dreaded injury. I was surprised that he was even back, and I just didn't think that he had a clear path to a big workload as a big underdog, even though he does catch passes. Tevin Coleman ends up playing a ton of snaps. That ends up being the right call, but Myles Gaskin is just as bad. But my point is, once I decide Gaskin is my play, the other big decision points that I have are tight end and quarterback. When there was this much salary left over, I just thought, kind of like we talked about with your lineup, on such a bad slate, like there just aren't. We didn't have really slate breakers. I mean, it was the lowest scoring day in 27 years or something like that. I don't remember the exact stat, but there was just like there were barely any touchdowns scored. So my thinking is Kittle and Murray have the highest floors at their position. They can absolutely break the slate. And I was on the same I was on the same boat as you were, looking at Kyler versus Josh Allen. Like, I was just worried about Josh Allen not running because of his foot. I thought he would still have a good game. He actually only ran one time for 24 yards. So that prediction did end up being true. And then I was thinking about like playing a random defense, going down from the Bills and maybe moving up from Barrios once I decided I want to lock those guys in. But once we got news that the Panthers were without a kicker, it was like, oh, I'm just going to eat it on the Bills, because if the Panthers get in this scenario where they get a couple field goal, in field goal range, but are forced to go for it on fourth down, like you can never project a shutout, but it was like this Panthers team without a kicker, like they could be put in some really bad shutout decisions. So Barrios was just popping on the lineup generator, and he fit. I mean, he gets there with a lucky rushing touchdown, barely does anything in the receiving game, but I would rather take a guy that got 10 targets the week before and get all of these other players in my lineup, and I was pretty comfortable with it.
Yeah, I think it's a clever move. I don't know if I would have been able to get there. I would have said, okay, I already have Gaskin and Parker. Do I really want to game stack Jets, Dolphins in my cash game lineup? Yeah. And yet, you take 10 targets at 2% owned all the time. That makes a lot of sense. And then it gets there as a rushing, rusher. That's hilarious.
It's just, I mean, it's very non-traditional. Like I said, I was always going for wide receivers, but I like the only, once I realized I can get Adams, Kittle, Kyler Murray, and Bills defense in there with our obvious value plays, I just didn't think it was going to be worth it to get off of a complete punt to, like, obviously if I go down to like from Kittle to Andrews, I crush, but I just never thought that Andrews with possibly Tyler Huntley has that, that big of a monster game in him. So I think it was just way more focused on getting those studs in there.
Yeah. No, I don't think Andrews... obvious late swap option, not better than Kittle, objectively on paper, going into this weekend.
Yeah, I think that the big mistake for me was the Myles Gaskin play. I don't know who else I would have played. I can look at the DraftKings lineup generator, but like I said, I was never playing Michael Carter, and then our other values on the slate were... Give me 1 second, I'll pull it up. Our other values on the slate were Javonte, who I thought he was a really bad play just with the share with Melvin Gordon. I was never paying up for Najee in cash games because that would have ruined my pass catchers. Like, I guess CPAT, but that $1,300 would have been tough to get to. So I just didn't really have another player that I was confident in. But there were a lot of, if you read the tea leaves, suggestion that Gaskin might fall out of that workload, even though I think he had 15 touches in like his last 5 games, 15 plus touches. But coming out, not practicing, coming off of COVID list late, and some light coach speak about him maybe not getting a full workload. Probably should have came off of him, but I don't know. I was really, really hell bent on getting to these studs. That was like my number one priority. You're muted. You're muted, Matt.
That I'm just getting excited over here about Duke Johnson and how he's finally getting unleashed like 8 years too late.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously never expect him to have that kind of workload. It is what it is. I mean, so many players on the slate busted. Obviously, even with my three snowflakes, I still end up having a pretty good day. I mean, the thing that stood out to me, people had obviously a lot of people did end up playing that Deontay Foreman play that we talked about. He was cheap enough, and then there were a few lineups that took the plunge on Huntley, and it ended up paying off. I'm assuming most people that did that had the thought in the back of their mind. They probably have Adams in there, probably have Kittle or Debo or something, and have a lot of late swap options if we found out that Jackson was playing. But indications were pretty strong that Lamar wasn't going, so maybe considering Huntley lineups. But I mean, Kyler just hitting his like absolute floor without it, like besides getting injured, is just like, I mean, that's literally probably a 1 out of 100 outcome there.
Yeah, what are you gonna do? Honestly, it kind of leads into what would I have changed, if anything. Is like next time I would simply not have the Cardinals lose in an unprecedented way to a 1-11-1 team. I think it was the worst loss from a team with double-digit wins to a team with less than 2 wins in NFL history.
And we always like talk about fragility of the NFL, and on any given day a team could lose. So it's not even that, like, obviously it's a crazy surprise that they lose, but we see games where, a random pick six happens against a really bad team, and all of it, now it's a close game, and a bad team squeaks it out. It's the fact that Kyler had 3 rushing yards. Like, I can't even wrap my head around how that happens in any game, especially when they're losing. Like, how is that even possible? That's crazy to me.
That's nuts. Hey, and here's something really interesting. In that big double up I was talking about where 16,000 people entered, Tyler Huntley was 0.1% owned on FanDuel.
Yeah, that, I mean, yeah. That kind of, I mean, I guess that makes sense. I think
Because
that
you
has a
didn't need
lot
to
to
get
do.
there.
It has a lot to do. Yeah, you didn't need to get there, and it has a lot to do with him being in the late window, I think. Let's talk about I mean, everything surprised us on this slate, so really you can say anything you want. But what are some of the things that did stand out to you?
Well, I definitely think that Jeff Wilson Jr. finally getting there really helped a lot of people. Here, sorry, scrolling down the show sheet, my computer froze. Here's the big thing that I noticed. 4 tight ends had 10-plus targets between Thursday and Sunday, and all are on the Week 16 main slate. I believe I didn't finish checking every week this season, but I believe the 4 tight ends in double-digit targets is the most this season. And it's players you all know. Kelsey, Andrews, Ertz, and Gronk. Just bring it back to 2019, why don't you? So they all get Week 16 main slate usage. Should be a very strong tight end week. Maybe a double stud tight end flex week in tournaments. Maybe
I like that.
It's
like
early.
that.
Dallas's offense is something that kind of surprised me. They're kind of meh as of late, down to 14th in the NFL in EPA per play, so basically league average. But their defense is now number 1 in the NFL in that same metric on the defensive side of the ball. So, hey, with a defense that good and Dak Prescott and 3 great weapons, you can make some noise in the playoffs. Yeah. And finally, the Jags are just really, really bad. Really bad right now. And James Robinson gets there, but I think we kind of got bailed out by touchdowns. Like, I don't know if I really want anything to do with this team going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the James Robinson thing is, I thought he was a tremendous fade in GPPs, just because I thought there was a really good chance that the Jaguars offense looked like the Jaguars offense. I mean, I think teams probably still have a lot of success with James Robinson yesterday because he has a decent day, but I thought that his score, like the running back position, I was like, if you roster a running back and he gets you 15 or 16, he's probably at least matching Robinson at a way lower ownership. But it was just really, really ugly. I mean, the way Tyler Huntley played is probably the biggest surprise for me. Like, he just looked really, really good against a Packers defense that had been playing really well. I had considered him for GPPs and just never pulled the trigger. Obviously, if you end up doing that, you probably had a fantastic day. But I was on the other side of that game. Dolphins just completely phasing out Myles Gaskin. I don't think Duke Johnson is somebody that I'm going to be targeting heavily. I think Miles not practicing a lot and coming off the COVID list late has a little bit to do with it. I'm guessing it'll be closer to an even-ish split. I don't know if Duke just all of a sudden gets like a crazy big workload overnight. And then, I mean, not on the main slate, but Buccaneers getting shut out is just insane to me. And now that they have the all those injuries to deal with, it's going to be a really interesting situation to monitor, especially if they still end up carrying like a decent implied point projection, seeing how their ownership shakes out on some slates. I don't know if they're on the main slate next week, but I think after this really bad week, I think it should be a really interesting week going forward.
Yeah, I'm excited for these last few weeks here. Really getting into the grind when lots of people are already bailing out in the holiday season or going to other sports.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any like big takeaway that you have going into these last couple weeks?
Just stay focused and don't have the Cardinals lose in terrible ways.
Yeah. We're getting into we're getting really close to like the teams getting eliminated from playoff territory, that part of the season. So just being cognizant, obviously we'll be writing about it in our articles if it is pertinent information, but keeping in the back of your mind that we could start seeing some higher variance plays, some guys maybe playing less snaps than expected on teams that don't have playoff aspirations. So we'll keep tracking those things going forward.
Yes, sir. Excited to do it.
Yeah, as always, thank you everybody for watching and listening. Please like us on YouTube and follow the 4for4 channel on YouTube. As a reminder, our rest of season price is down to $24, and if you use the promo code DFSMVP, you could get an additional 10% off. We're going through Super Bowl, lots of extra slates coming up. One housekeeping note for this week: DFS MVP on Friday will be moved to 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern time on Friday, so we'll definitely tweet to remind you guys of that. But if you're used to our regular 6 p.m. window, we're moving that up this week for the holiday. Yahoo DFS MVP, Yahoo DFS values with Matt Harmon usually comes out on Saturday. That will be coming out on Friday because of the holiday. GPP Last Look Show with Jordan Vanek. That will be at our normal 11 a.m. Eastern time window. You can join that Discord in the description below. Make sure you follow us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.